Hello and welcome to the daily routine training, avoiding flow, self-sabotage with your daily planning. There is a cost to not knowing this information and a benefit to knowing it. The goal of this training is to really improve your daily routine based on principles of flow without having any fixed schedules or plans prescribed. So the costs of not knowing are the impacts of wasting more time, not being able to focus, and having more self-sabotage like distractions and procrastination. The benefits are the inverse of those. And another thing that's good to know is this training is very complementary to the recovery training. So putting these two things together, you can really get the full benefits of flow. Specifically in this training, we're not going to tell you to wake up at a certain time, but we are going to get to stop distraction and procrastination, as well as dopamine addiction type of self-sabotage. You're going to get a 30 to 90% boost in your performance, depending on your starting points. You'll be more able to intuitively understand your personal biorhythms, create your own unique schedule, and improve your energy awareness on the fly. You'll also be able to know with better accuracy how to plan what types of tasks to do at what times of the day, as well as make sure that you balance the optional things with the non-negotiables that should never be missed on a daily basis. So what we'll cover in this video, and by the way, if you haven't watched the flow cycle training, it's recommended that you watch that one before this. And as I said before, the information in here complements the active recovery training video. So in this training, we'll talk in 3 parts. In the first part, we'll talk about chronobiology, which is what we're going to get into right now. We'll talk about dopamine considerations in your daily planning, and we'll talk about the non-negotiables of peak performance, what absolutely cannot be missed. So let's dive in. Welcome to part 1. Peak performance is not just about how to, but it's about when to. We know that energy ebbs and flows throughout the day, and peak performance and achieving the most that you can is nothing more and nothing less than surrendering to your biology. We're human beings, we're a biological creature, we're an animal, and that means there are constraints. So what is chronobiology? It's the study of the timings and the cycles and durations of biological events. So some examples of this are things like digestion, sleep and wake, stress or activation, and various hormone levels and neurotransmitters. So there are ways in which we can be working more in alignment with nature versus ways in which we're forcing ourselves a bit more and going against biology, which are less efficient for our performance. And so in this mini section, we'll go over chronotypes, we'll go over biorhythms, and we'll talk a bit about how to map the types of activities and rest based on these things. So as I said, there's no prescribed schedule. Everyone is different. So we're going to talk about finding your own chronotype. This is the graph of what a chronotype chart looks like. And on the left-hand side, we have percentage of the population that have this particular midpoint of sleep, which is on the bottom axis. So that's in hours. And it's a spectrum, so there's no fixed categories, but rather it's a continuum. These color codes are just guidelines as to what type of people have extremely early midpoints versus extremely late midpoints. And about 60 to 70% of the population is in that kind of average range or close to the average. So basically, it's what determines if you are an early bird or a late night owl or an in-between bird. And important to note that society is not equally privileged in terms of chronotypes. It is certainly a bit harder to be a night owl when you have work and businesses and schools that are typically open between 8, 9 and 4, 5 p.m. So that is one thing to take into account. So how do we I've basically talked about how much of an early riser or night person you are, which is early bird or night owl. And intuitively, you kind of have a sense of this, but there's a couple of ways that you can really get more data points and confirm what your intuition are. And by the way, chronotype is determined by a mix of your genetics, your exposure to light on a daily basis, your lifestyle and habits, as well as your age and overall health. Most people over-rely on time-based planning, like I have to start this at 8, I have to start this at 9:30, and less on energy and state planning. So what actually happens is when you're too much fixated on time, then you might be doing some work when you're actually in a low needing rest kind of level. But when you start to shift the time-based planning or better integrate time-based planning with energy and state-based planning, then you can really start to surf your biorhythms and work at your peak when you're in a peak state and recover in order to bounce back when you're not in a peak state. And before we go and before I talk about how do we find out our chronotype, the important thing to know about chronotypes is that they map for different kind of people what kind of activities are best for them at what time. So different activities have different optimal whens for different kinds of people. And so we'll define creative activities and focused activities as ones where it's helpful or self-sabotaging for your mind to wander off in different directions and make new creative connections. Because that's one of the sources of distractions, is when our mind is in a creative state and making new connections, how susceptible are we to succumb to whatever that creative thinking was. But on other hands, in other times, it's very important to be in that creative state. So some examples are focused work is the kind that's highly cognitive, logical, deep work where you just have to sit down and power through the execution of a task. And creativity is something that would maybe detract from the goal of getting that task done. And on the other hand, creative work or thinking outside the box, kind of strategy work, problem solving, storytelling, even marketing and the obvious arts and design are ones where it's actually helpful for your mind to wander and connect different concepts in order to actually do the task better. So it's always a balance, and it's not like it's a binary switch between the two, but it's a helpful model to have as a basic in order to kind of help plan your day. And so bringing this back to chronotypes and how do we do it? One way is to use this chart. So you ask yourself 3 questions. What time do you usually go to bed? What time do you usually wake up? And then the midpoint between those 2 times. And if you have any constraints, like you have to get up at 6 a.m. for work, but that's not what you would naturally do, assume that this is in the case where there are no constraints and you have the whole day to yourself. How would you answer those questions? And then based on the midpoint, you can find your chronotype as whether you're in the earlier range, in the later range, or kind of closer to the average. Or there's another mechanism, which is a self-test, self-evaluation called the Automated Morningness Eveningness Questionnaire. And I will put the link in the description of the video below. So you're welcome to take that test. It takes about 5 minutes to do, and it'll give you a bit more information on that as well. Highly recommend. It's worth checking that second data point, and there's a bit more info in that link as a result that will help you with your daily habits. And just an example of using the charts, if you would naturally go to bed at midnight and naturally wake up at 8, then that midpoint would be 4 a.m. And so you'd be in that slightly early range. So that's how you use this chart. Feel free to pause this video, take some notes. Otherwise, I will move on. Practicals. So I mentioned about the tasks. This is how to map them together. If you're an early bird, you generally want to have your focus time in the morning and your creative times in the afternoons. If you're a night owl, you might want to have a bias for your creative work in the morning and your focused work more in the afternoons and evenings. And of course, as I mentioned, this is a spectrum. So the more of an extreme you are on the spectrum, the more this is kind of helpful and applies. The more you're closer to the average, the less you can be extreme with this. You don't need to really block out only focus in the morning and only creative in the evening. You can kind of mix it up a bit more the closer you are to that middle. So again, this is just a basic model, but it's useful to work in alignment with how your personal biology works for you. And again, just the definitions as a reminder. Focused work is the kind of deep work where you don't want any distractions and where the mind coming in, wandering is a time and energy sink, whereas creative work is ones where it's actually helpful for the mind to wander. Another thing about chronobiology is we know that our physiology operates in a circular fashion. We have sleep cycles at night and circadian rhythms, which is our sleeping and waking. But even within that, we can see that there's lots of peaks and valleys, as we see in this circadian rhythm chart. And so I want to focus on this waking hour portion of the chart and really talk about these highs and lows. These ones are what's called ultradian cycles. And they're basically cycles that happen more than once per 24 hours. And this is the basic activity and rest cycle, rest activity cycle. And it's about 90 to 120 minutes long. It happens quite a few times a day, 4, 5, 6 times a day within waking hours, and then also happens during sleep. But it's a cycle in which you experience a significant burst of energy, and then you find that your body is craving rest. So the guideline is about 15 to 30 minutes of rest and recovery in some shape or form during a 90 to 120 minute cycle. And that recovery period is within the cycle. So not 120 minutes plus 30 minutes of recovery. It would be like a 90-minute, then 30-minute break. And again, if you're in a deep, deep flow state, you might be finding yourself working for 2-3 hours in a big block without noticing time passing by. And that's great for making progress. But from a biology standpoint, then you really have to be conscious when that happens, that you need that big break and the information in the recovery video to really optimize how fast you boost your brain back up to that performance level. And otherwise, just kind of keep an awareness of this 90 minute, 60 minute, and 15, 30-minute break as you go throughout your day. Because during the rest period, you have to work really, really hard against your biology to get anything done, especially if you're in a struggle phase of the flow cycle. If you're in flow, not so much, because you lose the ego, you lose the sense of time, you're so absorbed by the task. But it's an extremely expensive state to be in from a recovery neurochemistry standpoint if you're in a deep, deep flow. So hence the importance of also training the skill of recovering. And of course, because the human being is an amazing creature, even if it goes against your biology, you still can do it, despite it not being ideal. But what happens as a consequence of that is there's a uptick in stress hormones, and it's fine. It's a built-in mechanism to do it, to override this craving for rest period if our life is in danger. You know, evolutionarily, it comes from situations like that. But if you are doing this on a daily basis, it's really not recommended because it could lead to chronic illness or stress or other mental health issues. So definitely keep this idea of pushing through as a only emergency protocol. And as for the rest, do refer to the active recovery training video. A quick summary of this little section. The big idea is to optimize your daily routine by balancing work and rest based on your biology. We have the type of work between focus and creative work for early birds versus night owls. And depending on your chronotype, you can have a better idea of that. And then when to rest, we have talked about the guidelines of intuitive energy and state surfing using the ultradian cycles that happen during the day. So the guideline is 15 to 30 minutes per 90 to 120-minute cycle. And finally, experiment to find out what works for you. So that's the end of chronobiology.